Assata Shakur was born Joanne Deborah Byron on July 16, 1947. Her birthplace was Jamaica, a neighborhood in Queens, New York City. She entered the world during a time of social change in the United States. The aftermath of World War II was reshaping American cities. Families were moving, populations were shifting, and new generations were coming of age in a country facing questions about race, equality, and opportunity. Her family life in those early years was not steady. Her parents separated when she was still very young. As a result, she spent much of her childhood moving between relatives. She lived for stretches of time with her mother and also with her grandparents in Wilmington, North Carolina. These changes meant that she grew up with a sense of two different worlds. Life in New York exposed her to the bustle of the city, while life in North Carolina placed her in the segregated South. In North Carolina, she saw clear signs of separation between black and white communities. Schools, restaurants, and neighborhoods often reminded her of the rigid lines that divided people. Even as a child, she noticed the way rules were set and enforced. In New York, things looked different on the surface, but she could still sense the presence of barriers and unfair treatment. These contrasting settings helped form her early awareness of how society worked. School was not always a place where she felt supported. Teachers sometimes discouraged her questions or treated her as though her curiosity was unwelcome. She often resisted strict instructions that did not make sense to her. Stories from those years suggest that she was strong-willed and stubborn in her own way. Friends and relatives later recalled that she never liked to be told something without understanding why. Books became a steady part of her life. Reading gave her a way to travel beyond her surroundings. She discovered stories of people in other places, in different times, facing challenges and creating change. She developed the habit of questioning what she was told and searching for her own answers. This trait would follow her into adulthood. Family life shaped her personality as well. Her grandparents in the South were strict, but they gave her a sense of discipline. In New York, her mother worked hard to provide stability. The moves between these homes created a sense of independence in young Joanne. She learned to adapt to new settings, new schools, and new expectations. One story from her early years tells of her determination to speak up when she thought something was unfair. As a young girl in school, she challenged a teacher who dismissed her opinion during a lesson. Instead of remaining silent, she insisted on being heard. The incident stayed with her because it showed her that authority figures did not always welcome questions, even when those questions were thoughtful. It left her with the lesson that standing up for herself could come at a cost, but also with the knowledge that silence would not bring her peace. By the time she reached her teenage years, she had already built a reputation in her family as someone who was strong-minded. Relatives often described her as headstrong, unwilling to back down from an argument, and eager to prove that she could make her own decisions. This streak of independence would guide her choices as she moved from childhood into adulthood. As Joanne Byron entered her teenage years, she found herself drawn more and more to independence. Life in New York gave her opportunities that were not available in the South, but it also exposed her to struggles that shaped her outlook. Schools were crowded, neighborhoods could be tough, and the city often demanded that young people learn quickly how to take care of themselves. At school, she sometimes felt out of place. She was bright and curious, but she did not always feel that her teachers saw her potential. Some treated her as a problem because she refused to accept things at face value. She asked questions, and she challenged authority when instruction seemed unfair. This created tension, but it also showed her that she had a voice, even if others did not want to hear it. During her high school years, she also started to take small jobs. These were the kinds of jobs many teenagers in New York picked up to help their families or to earn pocket money. She worked in restaurants, shops, and other places where long hours and low pay were common. These experiences taught her how hard people work just to get by. She saw up close the struggles of working-class families in the city, and she noticed how race shaped the kinds of opportunities people could expect. Her teenage years were not without conflict at home. She often clashed with her mother over rules and restrictions. Joanne wanted freedom while her mother wanted safety and order. These disagreements sometimes became heated, and for stretches of time, Joanne left home altogether. She lived on her own, surviving by relying on friends, odd jobs, and her own determination. This period of running away was difficult, but it was also formative. She learned how to navigate the streets of New York, how to rely on herself, and how to survive without the constant guidance of adults. She later admitted that these years were risky, filled with choices that could have gone wrong, but they also hardened her sense of independence. By the mid-1960s, America was changing quickly. The civil rights movement was gaining strength in the South, and in northern cities, young people were beginning to organize around issues of race, poverty, and war. Joanne felt pulled toward these new voices. She read newspapers, listened to speeches, and paid attention to community meetings. One story from this time illustrates how her awareness was sharpening. While walking in her neighborhood, she saw a group of young activists handing out leaflets. They spoke about police harassment in Harlem and about the treatment of black communities across the country. Instead of passing by, she stopped and listened. She asked questions, took the leaflet, and later read it closely. The words stayed with her. For the first time, she felt that people were describing things she had seen with their own eyes, and they were doing so with clarity and courage. In high school, she began to test her own voice more often. She joined debates, spoke in classrooms, and expressed opinions that sometimes put her at odds with authority figures. These moments, though small, gave her confidence that she could speak on issues larger than herself. Another incident highlighted her growing sense of justice. During one class, she noticed a teacher treating black students differently from white students. While others stayed silent, Joanne challenged the teacher openly. She asked why the expectations were not the same. The room fell silent, and the teacher dismissed her, but the memory stuck with her. It showed her how inequality could be present even in everyday places like classrooms. By the time she graduated, Joanne was restless. She had grown tired of what she saw as routine paths laid out for young women of her background. She did not want to simply take a job, settle into a quiet life, and avoid conflict. She wanted something more. The turbulence of the 1960s was calling, and she was ready to answer. These teenage years were not easy. They were filled with movement, clashes, and uncertainty. But they were also the foundation for what came next. She had discovered her independence, she had tested her voice, and she had begun to notice that her life was connected to larger struggles unfolding across the nation. After finishing high school, Joanne Byron took her first steps into higher education. She enrolled at the Borough of Manhattan Community College in New York City. Later, she would also attend City College of New York. These institutions opened new doors for her, not only in academics but also in exposure to political ideas and social movements. College life in the mid-1960s was a time of rapid change. Across campuses in the United States, students were questioning the Vietnam War, racial segregation, and the roles of government and police. New York City, with its large student population and diverse communities, was a central stage for these debates. Joanne found herself in the middle of this environment. At first, she tried to balance the demands of classes with the pull of social life in the city, but soon the energy of the times pushed her toward activism. She attended meetings where students discussed civil rights, listened to speakers who challenged American foreign policy, and joined gatherings that raised awareness about poverty in black neighborhoods. These meetings showed her that she was not alone in her frustration. Others, too, were asking why so much inequality persisted. During this period, she also began to meet members of groups that were shaping the political scene. Among them were activists connected to the Black Panther Party, which had been founded in Oakland, California in 1966 and was spreading across the country. The Panthers were known for their programs that served communities such as free breakfast for children and neighborhood clinics, as well as their open stance against police brutality. Joanne was drawn to the Panthers, but she was not ready to join right away. Instead, she observed their work, listened to their message, and considered how it fit into her own experiences. She began to read more widely about African American history, colonialism, and global struggles for independence. Books by writers from Africa, the Caribbean, and Latin America filled her shelves. She wanted to understand not only the problems in her own community, but also the struggles of oppressed people around the world. A turning point came during a protest she joined in New York. The demonstration was aimed at the Vietnam War and at racial injustice in the city. As students gathered, police arrived to control the crowd. Tensions rose quickly. What had started as chants and speeches turned into a scene of shoving, arrest, and fear. Joanne was not arrested that day, but she never forgot the sight of her peers being pushed into police vans. She left the protest shaken but more convinced than ever that she needed to take an active role. In her college years, she also wrestled with her identity. She began to move away from the name Joanne Byron and took the name Assata, meaning she who struggles, and Shakur, meaning thankful. The new name reflected the direction her life was taking. It symbolized a rebirth of sorts, a commitment to a different path. Names held power, and this change signaled that she was embracing a role that tied her personal story to a larger movement. Another incident highlighted the challenges of her journey. While studying at City College, she noticed how black students were often underrepresented in advanced classes. When she and others raised concerns, administrators dismissed their complaints. In response, student activists staged sit-ins and pressed for more inclusive programs. Assata watched closely, taking part in discussions and beginning to use her own voice in support of change. The late 1960s were also a time when law enforcement grew increasingly wary of student activism. Groups that questioned authority were often monitored, and meetings were sometimes infiltrated. Assata, like many of her peers, noticed the presence of police at protests and the surveillance of activist spaces. It gave her a sense that simply speaking out came with risks. Still, she pressed forward. By the end of her college years, she was no longer a teenager testing her independence. She had become a young woman with a purpose. She was shaping her identity, building knowledge, and stepping into the current of a movement that was spreading through cities across America. By the late 1960s, Assata Shakur had become deeply involved in political thought and activism. The unrest of the decade was all around her. The assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in 1968 had shocked the nation. Urban neighborhoods saw protests, uprisings, and police crackdowns. The war in Vietnam continued to divide the country. Against this backdrop, Assata made the decision to join the Black Panther Party. The Panthers had started in Oakland, California, but their ideas spread rapidly. They were not only about carrying weapons and confronting police, as the media often portrayed. They also organized community programs. They gave free breakfast to children before school. They opened health clinics where people could see doctors at no cost. They taught classes on history and politics. These activities appealed to Assata because they were practical, visible acts of service. When she became a member, Assata worked on projects that directly served people. In Harlem, she helped with the free breakfast program. She and others would wake up early, prepare meals, and serve children before classes. She also assisted with health programs and spoke with families about their needs. This work brought her into close contact with everyday struggles in Black neighborhoods. She listened to stories of poor housing, lack of access to medical care, and constant harassment by police. The work was rewarding, but it was not easy. Running programs meant long hours and constant effort. Supplies were always short. Volunteers had to stretch every resource. Still, the Panthers persisted, and Assata grew more committed as she saw the impact of these services. Inside the organization, however, she also noticed tensions. The Panthers were often under heavy pressure from police and the FBI. Government surveillance programs, such as COINTELPRO, specifically targeted them. Meetings were infiltrated, leaders were arrested, offices were raided. This atmosphere of pressure created suspicion within the group. At times, members argued over leadership, direction, and tactics. Assata also saw gender conflicts. Some men in the movement expected women to take secondary roles, such as typing or answering phones. Assata resisted this. She wanted to be active in all areas, including leadership and public action. Her refusal to stay quiet or accept limits sometimes caused friction, but it also showed her determination to contribute fully. One memorable story from this time comes from her experience working with children. At a breakfast program, a boy asked her why the police always seemed to hate the Panthers. Assata explained that the Panthers wanted to protect the community and give people what they needed, while the police wanted to stop them. The boy thought about her words and then said he wanted to grow up and help people too. For Assata, that moment stood out. It showed her that even small acts like serving a meal could spark awareness in the next generation. She also witnessed the risk firsthand. On more than one occasion, police entered Panther offices, searched for weapons, or arrested members without warning. Sometimes these confrontations turned violent. Assata later recalled the constant feeling of being watched, followed, or targeted. Living under that level of pressure tested her resolve, but it also hardened her sense that she was part of something larger than herself. By the early 1970s, cracks within the Black Panther Party became harder to ignore. Internal disagreements, arrests of key leaders, and constant government harassment weakened the organization. Assata began to question whether the Panthers could survive in their current form. Still, her years in the party had left a deep mark. She had learned how to organize, how to serve, and how to resist. As she prepared for the next stage of her journey, she carried with her the lessons of those Harlem kitchens, community clinics, and long nights of planning. She had found her voice in the streets and in the movement. What lay ahead would be even more demanding. By the early 1970s, the Black Panther Party was weakening. Years of pressure from the FBI, constant surveillance, and violent confrontations with police had left the organization divided. Many leaders were in prison, in exile, or under heavy restrictions. Assata Shakur saw these changes up close. She respected the work the Panthers had done, especially in the community, but she also felt that the group was no longer able to carry out its original mission in the same way. During this time, she grew closer to activists who believed that direct armed struggle was the next step. This group became known as the Black Liberation Army, or BLA. The BLA was made up largely of former Panthers and other militants who believed that resistance to racism and oppression required stronger action. They lived secret lives, often underground, moving from place to place and avoiding the constant gaze of police. For Assata, this transition marked a dramatic shift. The Panthers had operated in public, with offices, newspapers, and community programs. The BLA, by contrast, worked in the shadows. They believed that the government would never allow open groups like the Panthers to survive, so they took their fight out of sight. This meant secrecy, new identities, and constant caution. Life in the underground was difficult. Members often changed names, addresses, and even appearances. Trust was essential, but it was also fragile. The risk of infiltration was high. If someone was caught, they could be pressured into giving information about others. For Assata, living this way meant being cut off from normal routines of family, work, and stability. The BLA was linked to a number of dramatic incidents in the early 1970s. Police accused them of robberies, shootouts, and attacks on officers. Supporters said these actions were meant as retaliation against years of brutality. Critics saw them as dangerous acts of violence. Assata herself was charged in several cases during this period, though many of those charges were later dropped due to lack of evidence or mishandled trials. One striking story from this time highlights the risks she faced. In 1971, she was accused of being involved in a bank robbery in Queens. She was arrested, but the case against her collapsed. The prosecution relied on shaky testimony, and eventually the charges were dismissed. Still, the experience showed her how quickly she could be taken into custody and how the legal system could hold her for long stretches even when evidence was thin. Another incident in 1972 brought more attention. She was accused of kidnapping drug dealers in Brooklyn. Again, the case fell apart, but not before Assata spent months in court and behind bars. Each new arrest drew headlines. Each headline painted her as a militant figure, often without the full story being clear. For Assata, these experiences confirmed her belief that the system was stacked against her. Whether guilty or not, she felt she would always be treated as a suspect because of her politics and her associations. At the same time, each arrest deepened her image in the public eye as a dangerous figure. Life in the underground also meant constant tension. Assata and her companions sometimes moved apartments in the middle of the night. They relied on networks of supporters who provided safe houses and resources. They avoided phones, cars, and routines that could be traced. Simple acts like buying groceries or taking a walk carried risk. Despite the difficulties, Assata continued to believe in the cause. She gave speeches, wrote statements, and tried to explain why she and others felt armed resistance was necessary. She argued that the United States had a long history of using violence against Black people, and that expecting peaceful protest alone to bring change was unrealistic. Her words attracted both admiration and outrage. By 1973, Assata's life had become a cycle of arrests, court hearings, and cautious freedom. The authorities saw her as a leading figure in the BLA. Supporters saw her as a target of political persecution. This tension set the stage for the most famous. Throughout the early 1970s, Assata Shakur faced a series of arrests and trials that kept her constantly inside courtrooms and jail cells. Each case drew attention, and each added to her growing reputation as a controversial figure. To her supporters, she was being targeted for her political beliefs. To law enforcement, she was considered dangerous and linked to armed groups. Her first major arrest came in April 1971, when she was accused of participating in a bank robbery in Queens, New York. She was taken into custody, and the story quickly spread through newspapers. Yet when the case went to trial, the evidence was weak, witnesses contradicted themselves, and the prosecution could not link her directly to the crime. Eventually, the charges were dismissed. Still, Assata had already spent time behind bars, and the experience showed her how accusations alone could damage her freedom. Not long after, in 1972, she was arrested again, this time accused of kidnapping drug dealers in Brooklyn. The trial stretched on for months. The courtroom was tense, with heavy security and reporters watching closely. In the end, she was acquitted. The jury found no clear evidence that she had been involved. But again, the process kept her locked up for long stretches, even without a conviction. In another case, she was accused of involvement in a robbery of the Bronx Bank. The trial took place in 1973. Once again, after months of testimony, she was acquitted. The prosecution failed to prove her role. These repeated arrests became a pattern. Even when she was found not guilty, Assata felt that the system was wearing her down. Each time, she was moved between facilities, searched, and placed under constant watch. She was sometimes kept in solitary confinement. She later described how difficult it was to be held in small cells for days at a time, with little contact with the outside world. One of the most notable cases during this period was her trial for bank robbery in Manhattan in 1971. In this case, the courtroom atmosphere was especially hostile. At one point, she and her attorney argued that she was not receiving fair treatment. She was occasionally forced to speak for herself when her lawyers were sidelined. The trial became less about evidence and more about the image of Assata Shakur as a militant figure. Eventually, the case collapsed, and she was acquitted. Despite these outcomes, law enforcement continued to pursue her. Each acquittal did not end her legal troubles. Instead, it seemed to open the way for new charges. Authorities were determined to tie her to the Black Liberation Army, and they sought to prove her involvement in violent acts. Assata's time in jail during these trials was harsh. She was often placed in facilities meant for men, isolated from other women. She was sometimes kept under 24-hour surveillance, with guards watching her constantly. At times, she was shackled during transport, and she complained of medical neglect when she needed treatment. Human rights groups raised concerns about her treatment, arguing that it violated basic standards of care and dignity. The series of arrests and trials created an image of Assata in the public eye. For many Americans reading headlines, her name became linked to crime, danger, and militancy. For others, especially within activist circles, she became a symbol of how far the government would go to silence dissent. By 1973, Assata was exhausted from the cycle of courts and cells. But she was still deeply involved with the Black Liberation Army. That spring, she would face the event that defined her life and placed her permanently in the spotlight, the New Jersey Turnpike confrontation. On the night of May 2, 1973, Assata Shakur was traveling with two companions on the New Jersey Turnpike. With her were Zaid Malik Shakur and Sundiata Akolai, both members of the Black Liberation Army. The three were driving south when they were stopped by state troopers. The official version given by police was that the car had a broken taillight and was weaving on the road. The troopers approached to investigate. What happened next remains disputed, but it ended in bloodshed. According to reports, words were exchanged and soon gunfire erupted. In the chaos, State Trooper Werner Forrester was killed. Zaid Malik Shakur was also shot and killed. Another trooper, James Harper, was wounded. Assata herself was struck by bullets, hit in both arms and in the chest. Despite her injuries, she was arrested at the scene. The aftermath was immediate and intense. Newspapers carried the story the next day with bold headlines. To law enforcement, this was proof that the Black Liberation Army was a direct threat to police. To supporters, questions arose about how the shooting started and whether Assata had actually fired a weapon. Witness accounts differed. Some said Assata had raised her hands when the shooting began, making it unlikely that she had pulled the trigger. Ballistic evidence later suggested she may not have fired a gun at all. Still, the death of a state trooper made the case a high priority for the government. Assata was taken from the highway in critical condition. She was rushed to a hospital under armed guard. Her wounds were severe, and she later described how little medical care she received at first. Even as she lay recovering, she was shackled to her hospital bed. Guards surrounded her room, limiting visits and placing her under strict watch. The New Jersey Turnpike shootout became the defining moment of her life. From then on, she was no longer simply a figure in a series of trials. She was seen as the face of militancy against the state. The FBI listed her as a prime target, and her name appeared in headlines across the country. For Assata, the shootout also meant years of new legal battles. She was charged with murder, armed robbery, and related offenses. She insisted that she was innocent of firing a weapon, pointing to her wounds as proof that she had not been in a position to shoot. But the legal system pressed forward, determined to secure a conviction. The event left her supporters and critics deeply divided. For law enforcement, the Turnpike confirmed the danger of the Black Liberation Army. For activists, it became an example of how police encounters with militants almost always ended violently, often with unanswered questions about who fired first. Assata's life after that night would be dominated by prison walls, courtrooms, and the question of whether she could survive the weight of the charges against her. The Turnpike incident has set her fate on a path that could not be undone. After the New Jersey Turnpike shootout, Assata Shakur began a new phase of her life inside prison walls. She was badly injured when she arrived in custody. Bullets had struck her in both arms and in the chest. Her recovery was slow, and her treatment as a prisoner added to her difficulties. In the hospital, she was kept under strict guard. Accounts say she was handcuffed to her bed, even while weak and unable to move. Guards surrounded her room. At times, bright lights were kept on through the night. Visitors were tightly controlled, and communication with her lawyers was limited. She later described feeling more like a captured enemy than a patient. Once her health improved enough for transfer, she was moved into correctional facilities. The conditions were harsh. She was often placed in isolation, away from other inmates. This meant long hours alone in small cells, sometimes with only minimal contact with the outside world. Authorities argued that her separation was for security, since they considered her a high-risk prisoner. Supporters saw it as an attempt to break her spirit. In some facilities, she was housed in men's wings rather than women's units. This unusual placement drew attention and concern. Activists and civil rights groups questioned why she was treated differently from other female prisoners. They argued that her conditions violated her basic rights. Assata herself continued to speak through letters and statements. She described the physical pain from her wounds, the emotional strain of solitary confinement, and the constant surveillance she faced. She also spoke about the way other prisoners were treated, using her platform to highlight issues inside the prison system. Her trials during this period stretched on. Courtrooms became extensions of her prison life. She was transported under heavy guard, often in shackles, and sat in courtrooms filled with armed officers. The atmosphere was tense, as if violence could break out at any moment. Public campaigns to support her grew during these years. Writers, students, and international activists began to speak out. They argued that her treatment was inhumane and that her trials were politically motivated. Some saw her as a prisoner of war in a struggle between the state and revolutionary groups. Demonstrations took place outside courthouses and prisons, with signs calling for her release. One well-known story from this time involves a letter she wrote to supporters. In it, she thanked them for remembering her and described how their letters lifted her spirits in the darkest hours of confinement. The letter was widely circulated, bringing even more attention to her case. Still, her legal battles continued. She faced multiple trials for different charges, including robbery, kidnapping, and the Turnpike incident. Some cases ended in acquittal, others in mistrials, and some remained open for years. But the Turnpike case overshadowed all others. Authorities were determined to convict her for the death of Trooper Werner Forster. As the mid-1970s unfolded, Assata's time in prison stretched into years. She grew more accustomed to life behind bars, but the strict conditions weighed heavily on her. At the same time, her image outside the walls grew larger. She was now both a symbol of resistance and a central figure in a national controversy. By the late 1970s, it became clear that the courts would not easily release her. Supporters worried she would spend the rest of her life in prison. Among them were people who began to plan something extraordinary, a way to break her free. By the late 1970s, Assata Shakur had been in custody for years. She had faced multiple trials with mixed outcomes, but the New Jersey Turnpike case remained central. In 1977, she was convicted of first-degree murder in connection with the death of Trooper Werner Forster. The verdict meant she was sentenced to life in prison plus additional years. For her supporters, the conviction was unjust, based on weak evidence and political pressure. For the authorities, it was the rightful punishment for a violent act. She was eventually transferred to the Clinton Correctional Facility for Women in New Jersey. The prison was meant to be secure, but those closest to her began to consider an escape. Assata's allies, many of them linked to underground networks, believed that she would never receive a fair chance through the legal system. They decided the only option was to take her out of prison by force. The plan required careful organization. Supporters studied the routines of guards, the layout of the facility, and the moments of weakness and security. Weapons were smuggled in. Communication had to be coded and cautious, since surveillance was constant. The operation took months to prepare. On November 2, 1979, the escape was carried out. 3 armed visitors entered the prison to see Assata. Once inside, they drew concealed weapons. Guards were taken by surprise. Shots were fired, but no one was killed. Assata was quickly moved out of the building and into a waiting vehicle. From there, the group switched cars and traveled through back roads to avoid police. Within minutes, she had disappeared into the underground network that had supported her before. News of the escape spread rapidly. By the end of the day, authorities had launched a massive manhunt. Roadblocks were set up, helicopters searched from the sky, and police moved through nearby towns. But Assata was gone. For years afterward, law enforcement continued to look for her. Wanted posters were distributed, and the FBI increased its efforts. The escape embarrassed state officials, who faced questions about how such a high-profile prisoner could have been freed. To her supporters, the escape was seen as a victory. They believed that she had been rescued from unjust imprisonment. To her critics, it was proof that she remained committed to militancy and violence. Either way, the escape made her one of the most famous fugitives in America. For Assata, the years after 1979 were spent in secrecy. She moved through safe houses, protected by networks of activists who risked their own freedom to hide her. For a time, no one knew where she was. Rumors spread that she had left the country, but there was no confirmation. The uncertainty only deepened her legend. Behind the headlines, Assata lived in constant caution. She had to change locations often, use false names, and remain invisible to authorities. Every sound outside a window or knock at the door could mean discovery. It was a tense existence, but one she endured as she waited for a permanent refuge. That refuge would eventually come from a surprising place, the island of Cuba. After her escape in 1979, Assata Shakur spent several years living underground. She moved from place to place, staying with supporters who risked their own safety to keep her hidden. For a time, no one knew where she had gone. The FBI placed her on its wanted list and increased its efforts to track her down. Rumors spread that she might have left the United States, but no clear information surfaced. By the early 1980s, Assata had found her way to Cuba. The exact details of her journey remain secret, but once she arrived, she was granted political asylum by the Cuban government. Fidel Castro himself later confirmed that she had been accepted, saying that Cuba viewed her as a victim of political persecution in the United States. In Havana, Assata began a new life. The pace was different from the constant movement and fear of capture that had marked her years underground. Still, she remained cautious. She lived under the watch of Cuban authorities, who offered protection but also expected her to maintain a low profile. Learning to adapt to Cuban society was not simple. She had to learn Spanish, build new routines, and find ways to support herself. Over time, she became a teacher, working with students in various programs. She also spoke with visiting journalists, though always carefully, knowing that her words would be closely studied in both Cuba and the United States. In Cuba, she raised her daughter, who had been born during her years of struggle in the 1970s. Motherhood gave her daily purpose and shaped her routines. She wanted her child to have stability, something she herself had rarely known in her youth. Life in Cuba provided a measure of that stability, even though it was under unusual circumstances. One of the most significant projects of her years in exile was her autobiography. Published in 1987, the book told her story in her own words. She described her childhood, her years in the Black Panther Party, the legal battles, the prison experience, and the escape. The book offered her perspective at a time when most accounts of her life came from court records and media reports. It attracted wide attention, with supporters praising its honesty and critics dismissing it as self-justification. Day-to-day life in Cuba was quieter than the years of activism and confrontation in the United States. She went shopping in local markets, took walks in Havana, and built friendships with other exiles. She stayed connected to the outside world by following international news and exchanging letters. She sometimes met with visiting activists who came to Cuba to learn from its political system. At the same time, the U.S. government never stopped pursuing her. Throughout the 1980s and 1990s, officials demanded her return. Requests for extradition were sent to Cuba, but the Cuban government refused. For the United States, she remained a fugitive convicted of killing a state trooper. For Cuba, she was a woman given shelter from persecution. Life in Havana offered Assata safety but also isolation. She could not return home, and she knew she was unlikely ever to do so. Each year, her status as an exile became more permanent. She built a life within those limits, balancing normal routines with the reality that she remained one of the most wanted people in America. By the time the 2000s arrived, she had lived in Cuba for 2 decades. She was no longer the young militant who had joined the Panthers. She was a middle-aged woman living quietly, raising her daughter, and reflecting on a life shaped by history, conflict, and survival.